The first sign that my inheritance was already gone did not come from a lawyer, a document, or a formal announcement, but from a single careless moment when my mother casually mentioned money that was never hers to give, and said it with such confidence that I understood instantly. I had been removed from my own future without being informed. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually feels safe, predictable, and emotionally neutral, which is why the betrayal cut deeper, because the most damaging decisions are often made quietly while everyone else assumes nothing has changed. As she spoke, smiling in a way that felt rehearsed rather than maternal, I realized something irreversible had already been signed, transferred, or promised away behind my back, and that whatever belonged to me had stopped belonging to me long before I noticed. Before I explain how my mother handed my inheritance to the man she chose over me, you need to know who I am, because this story is not about entitlement, but about legacy, manipulation, and what happens when blood loyalty is replaced by convenience. My name is Clara, and I am the only daughter of a man who spent his entire life building financial security not for luxury, but for protection, because he understood how fragile independence can be once it is taken away. My father passed away 4 years earlier in Pennsylvania, leaving behind a carefully structured investment portfolio and trust fund, something he built patiently over decades, designed to support my future, my safety, and my autonomy, not to fund someone else's comfort. My mother, Evelyn, was once fiercely protective of that plan, honoring my father's discipline and intentions while grieving him publicly, until grief slowly transformed into loneliness, and loneliness made her vulnerable to influence disguised as affection. The man who entered her life was Martin, someone she met late, trusted quickly, and elevated faster than anyone expected, because desperation often accelerates intimacy before trust has time to develop. There was also Jonathan, my father's longtime financial advisor, a quiet but meticulous professional who knew every detail of the trust, every safeguard written into it, and every reason my father insisted certain assets could never be reassigned casually. For years after my father's death, everything appeared stable on the surface, because routine can hide shifts in power when people do not look closely enough. I lived independently, built my own career, and visited my mother regularly, believing that my father's legacy remained untouched, because I trusted her to honor what was never meant to be negotiable. That trust began eroding the moment Martin became involved in decisions that had nothing to do with him. Because boundaries do not disappear suddenly, they are softened gradually until resistance feels inappropriate. At first, it was small things. Comments about shared futures, about simplifying finances, about restructuring assets to make life easier, language that sounded reasonable, until it started replacing my father's original intentions. Then came administrative changes that were never discussed with me, meetings I was not invited to, documents that were suddenly off limits, and explanations that felt deliberately vague rather than protective. What unsettled me most was not Martin's presence, but my mother's deference, the way she began seeking his approval before making decisions she once handled independently, as if authority had shifted silently while I was busy trusting the wrong person. When I finally asked about the trust, not accusingly but cautiously, my mother responded with reassurance instead of clarity, which immediately told me something had already been decided. She spoke about fairness, about partnership, about how love sometimes requires flexibility, language that frames sacrifice as maturity and obedience as understanding. I did not confront her then, because denial is powerful when it wears the face of family, and because part of me still believed number mother could deliberately undermine her own child's future. That belief did not survive the next realization. I arrived unexpectedly one evening, hoping to clear my thoughts, and sensed immediately that something had changed because energy shifts before truth becomes visible. Martin was present in a way that felt permanent rather than temporary, confident rather than grateful, as if his access to my father's assets had already been normalized. What unsettled me most was not his behavior, but my mother's comfort with it. Because comfort reveals permission, and permission reveals intent. That night, sleep became impossible, because once the idea of betrayal takes root, memories rearrange themselves into warnings you ignored too long. I replayed conversations that felt rushed, reassurances that lacked detail, and moments where I accepted explanations instead of demanding transparency. By morning, I understood something critical. My inheritance was no longer protected by trust or tradition, but by paperwork I had never seen and decisions I had never approved. The most painful realization was not that Martin wanted what belonged to me, but that my mother had decided I would adapt without it, because parents often assume resilience can replace security when it is inconvenient to provide both. What I did not know then was how far the transfer had already gone, how legally entangled it was, and how aggressively it had been justified as love rather than theft. I also did not know that my mother believed compliance would come naturally because she mistook my silence for acceptance and my patience for weakness. She underestimated one thing completely. I was not prepared to disappear politely from a future my father built deliberately, and I was no longer willing to watch my life be redistributed in the name of someone else's happiness. Because when inheritance is taken quietly, it is rarely returned peacefully, and I had reached the point where reclaiming what was mine would require pressure, exposure, and forceful truth. And as I sat alone that morning, finally accepting that my mother had chosen a man over her own daughter, I asked myself a question that would define everything that followed. If my future was taken without my consent, what was I willing to take back once I stopped asking for permission? Once the shock of realization settled into something quieter and heavier, I understood that panic would only benefit the people who wanted me uninformed, because confusion is the most useful shield for those who move assets in silence. I did not confront my mother again, not because I accepted what she had done, but because I needed clarity before emotion, and clarity only comes when you stop reacting and start observing. What troubled me most was not the betrayal itself, but the confidence behind it, because people do not speak so casually about theft unless they believe it has already been justified, legally, morally, or both. I began retracing the last 2 years carefully, and every moment where information was redirected or delayed. Because inheritance is rarely stolen in one act, it is dismantled through a series of permissions disguised as love. The trust my father created was complex by design, structured to protect against impulsive decisions, outside influence, and emotional pressure, which meant that whatever my mother and Martin had done required cooperation, patience, and planning. That knowledge alone told me this was not a sudden mistake, born of loneliness, but a deliberate strategy executed over time. I started with the safest place possible, not confrontation, but confirmation. Because truth does not argue, it reveals itself quietly to those who know where to look. Jonathan, my father's longtime financial advisor, had always been meticulous, to the point of discomfort. The kind of man who documented conversations even when they felt unnecessary, because he understood how easily intentions can be rewritten after death. Reaching out to him did not feel dramatic or desperate, it felt overdue, because my father trusted him precisely for moments like this, moments where silence could cost someone everything. What I learned through indirect confirmation was enough to confirm my worst fear without a single explicit admission, because the structure of the trust had been altered through amendments, not dissolutions, which made the changes appear cooperative rather than aggressive. Assets had not vanished outright. They had been repositioned, reclassified, and temporarily reassigned under language that emphasized partnership, shared futures, and spousal flexibility, terms that sound harmless until you understand what they allow. My mother had not removed me entirely, because that would have been too visible, too defensible, and too easy to challenge. Instead, she had reduced my access, delayed my control, and expanded Martin's influence under conditions framed as temporary, because temporary arrangements rarely return to their original state once power shifts. The most disturbing detail was how clean it all was, how carefully my absence was explained away as maturity, independence, and trust, because manipulation feels safest when it flatters the person being excluded. As I processed this, something inside me hardened, not with anger, but with resolve, because emotional reactions fade, but structural responses endure. I stopped asking myself why my mother did this and started asking how far she was willing to go to justify it, because justification reveals intent more clearly than motivation ever could. The answer became clearer as I observed her behavior more closely. She began speaking about finances with an authority she never had before, referencing decisions as finalized, presenting outcomes as inevitable, and framing my concerns as emotional rather than legitimate. Martin's presence became more pronounced, not overtly controlling, but strategically visible, as if his involvement needed to feel normal before it could be challenged safely. What made this phase dangerous was not their confidence, but their assumption that I would either accept the situation quietly or exhaust myself trying to argue emotionally, because both outcomes protected them equally. I chose neither. Instead, I began documenting everything, not through confrontation, but through pattern recognition, because patterns cannot defend themselves once exposed. I tracked dates, changes, and inconsistencies, noting when language shifted, when explanations contradicted earlier assurances, and when decisions were described as mutual despite my exclusion. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became that my mother had convinced herself this redistribution was fair, because she believed I had my own life and would not need what my father built, while Martin needed security now. What hurt was not just the assumption, but the entitlement behind it, the belief that my future could be negotiated away without my consent, simply because I appeared capable. That realization stripped the situation of its emotional ambiguity, because this was no longer about grief or loneliness but about control, disguised as practicality. The turning point came when I understood one crucial flaw in their plan. They believed legality equaled permanence, and permanence equaled safety, because they assumed I would avoid conflict at all costs. They were wrong. My father built the trust with contingencies, ethical triggers, and behavioral clauses meant to protect against exactly this kind of influence, provisions that only activate When someone is willing to enforce them rather than hope, they remain theoretical. What my mother and Martin did not understand was that shifting power quietly still leaves fingerprints, and fingerprints are impossible to erase. Once someone starts looking deliberately, the path forward became clear, not through anger, but through precision. If they wanted to frame theft as love, then exposure had to be framed as protection. If they wanted to hide behind paperwork, then pressure had to come from the structures they believed insulated them. I did not need to beg for my inheritance back. I needed to make keeping it impossible. And as I sat with this understanding, reviewing what I now knew and what I still needed to confirm, one thought anchored itself firmly in my mind. They believed I would retreat quietly. Once I understood how much power they had already taken, they did not realize that understanding was exactly what turned me from a bystander into a force they could no longer ignore. Because the moment inheritance becomes a weapon against you, reclaiming it stops being about entitlement and becomes an act of survival. And I was done surviving quietly. Once I stopped hoping for fairness and started preparing for enforcement, everything shifted internally. Because clarity removes fear and replaces it with focus. And focus is dangerous for people who rely on silence to keep control. I did not rush into action because haste would have given them time to adjust, and adjustment was the one thing I could not allow. Since my advantage now depended on surprise, structure, and inevitability, the trust my father built was not just a financial container. It was a moral instrument, layered with conditions designed to protect intent over convenience. And once I understood how those conditions worked together, the illusion of my mother's authority began to collapse. What she and Martin believed was ownership was actually access. And access can be revoked when behavior crosses predefined lines, especially when influence becomes coercive rather than supportive. The first shift happened quietly, not through confrontation, but through process, because systems respond more honestly than people do when pressure is applied correctly. Audits were triggered automatically once certain thresholds were questioned, and those thresholds existed precisely to flag situations where beneficiaries were marginalized under the guise of partnership. What made this effective was not aggression, but inevitability. Because once those mechanisms activate, personal explanations stop mattering, and documentation takes over completely. My mother sensed the change before she understood it, because confidence fades quickly when reassurance no longer comes from authority, and her tone shifted subtly, becoming cautious where it was once assured. Martin reacted differently, because opportunists often recognize danger faster than loyal partners, and his behavior became guarded, measured, and visibly strategic. Neither of them confronted me directly, because doing so would have required admitting awareness of processes they claimed were harmless, and acknowledgement would have accelerated consequences they were still trying to avoid. What followed was a slow tightening, rather than a dramatic collapse. Because control rarely disappears in one moment, it erodes as options vanish one by one. Accounts were frozen pending review. Authorizations were suspended temporarily. Access required justification rather than assumption. Each step felt administrative on the surface, but emotionally destabilizing underneath, because power that must be defended is power already weakening. My mother attempted to reframe the situation internally, convincing herself that this was procedural inconvenience rather than exposure. But denial only works when it is shared, and Martin no longer shared it. The shift in their dynamic became visible because stress reveals alignment cracks faster than disagreement ever could. Where my mother sought reassurance, Martin sought exit strategies because he understood that influence without insulation is liability, not opportunity. The moment everything became irreversible, because formal decisions carry weight that feelings never can, the trust's ethical enforcement clause was activated not by accusation, but by evidence of sustained influence that compromised the original beneficiaries' access and autonomy. That clause did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing explicitly. It simply restored balance by removing control from parties who benefited disproportionately from structural changes. In practical terms, this meant Martin's access was eliminated entirely, and my mother's authority was reduced to oversight rather than control, a distinction that dismantled everything they believed they had secured. The inheritance did not return symbolically. It returned operationally. Control shifted back to me in a way that could not be negotiated, delayed, or emotionally overridden, because the system now recognized what I had known instinctively from the beginning. My future had been compromised, under influence, and influence had crossed into exploitation. The aftermath was quieter than most people expect revenge to be, because accountability does not always arrive with confrontation. Sometimes it arrives with absence. Martin withdrew quickly, not dramatically, but decisively, because opportunity without access holds no appeal. For people like him, my mother was left alone with the reality of her decisions, stripped of the justifications that once made them feel reasonable. Because justification depends on shared belief, and hers no longer existed. The family noticed the change before explanations were offered, because resources dictate hierarchy, and hierarchy had been restored. Without announcement, my role shifted immediately, not because I demanded it, but because authority returns naturally when it no longer needs permission. What surprised my mother most was not losing control, but losing narrative. Because once the truth becomes structural rather than emotional, stories stop working. She could no longer frame her actions as love or partnership, because outcomes told a different story, one where her choices resulted in isolation rather than unity. Our relationship did not explode. It cooled permanently. Distance replaced intimacy, and accountability replaced assumption. Because trust does not survive decisions made in secrecy. I did not celebrate publicly or seek validation. Because reclaiming what was mine did not feel like victory, it felt like correction. My father's intention had been restored, not through permission or forgiveness, but through enforcement. Because some legacies are protected only when someone is willing to stop being agreeable. The most powerful consequence was not financial but relational, because my mother learned something she could never unlearn. I was no longer someone whose future could be negotiated away for comfort. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was honest, and honesty is more stable than affection built on compromise. As I moved forward with my life, secure again in the future my father built deliberately for me, I understood something that would stay with me forever. Inheritance is not just about money. It is about acknowledgement. And when acknowledgement is taken, reclaiming it becomes an act of self-respect rather than revenge. What my mother handed to her new lover was never truly hers to give. And what I took back was not forced through anger, but secured through resolve, structure, and truth. And if you're in my place, watching your future quietly reassigned, without your consent, would you wait for fairness? Or would you learn how to take back what was always meant to be yours? When family rewrites your future in silence, reclaiming it is not cruelty, it is responsibility.